Hey, this is Cole Rasmussen, and I am sharing my video for Biology 191 for action potential. A neuron has four main parts. First, you have what are the dendrites. Then you also have what is the cell body. The dendrites are what receives information. The cell body processes and integrates that information. You have the axon, which carries the information along long distances from one part of the neuron to another. And at the end, you have the axon terminals, which transmits the information to the next cell in the chain. A bunch of axons traveling together is called a nerve. And nerves are everywhere in the body, with some nerves running the full length of the human body. Dendrites are the part of the neuron that receives incoming signals. Based on the strength of the incoming stimulation, the neuron must decide whether to pass the signal along or not. If the stimulation is strong enough, the signal is transmitted along the axon in the phenomenon called an action potential. The transmission of a stimulation is completely dependent upon the charged ions. Various ions, including sodium, potassium, and chloride, are unequally distributed between the inside and the outside of the cell. Here is an example of a resting neuron. It's resting, and we would call this neuron polarized because it has what is an unequal distribution of the ions, where it's more negative on the inside and positive on the outside. The most important little piece of machinery in the neural system is positioned along the membrane of the cell, and it is called the sodium-potassium pump. For every 2 potassium ions it pumps into the cell, it pumps 3 sodium ions out of the cell. This pump is responsible for creating the electrical chemical gradient across the cell membrane. Nature hates gradients and wants to naturally equalize all gradients. So there are some other protein channels that help in the process and the exchange of ions that'll equalize out the gradient. Ion channels allow ions across the membrane with their respective ion channels when the respective ion channels open. When these gates open and close for different reasons at different times depending on their structure and purpose. Most of the ion gates are voltage-gated channels, which open at certain membrane potential and close at other moments. Ligated channels are channels that only open up when a specific neurotransmitter or hormone attaches to it. And then we have mechanically gated channels that open in response to physically stretching of the membrane. Now here is where the magic happens. The resting membrane potential of a neuron is around -70 millivolts. When neurotransmitters bind to the receptors of the dendrites of a neuron, they can have an effect on the neuron known as depolarization. This means they make the membrane potential less polarized, or cause it to move closer to zero. This chart shows membrane potential on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. When neurotransmitters interacting with receptors cause repeated depolarization of the neuron, eventually the neuron reaches what is known as the threshold membrane potential. In a neuron, when the membrane potential is at -70 millivolts, the threshold is generally around -55 millivolts. When threshold is reached, a large number of sodium channels open, allowing positively charged sodium ions into the cell. This causes massive depolarization of the neuron as the membrane potential reaches zero and even becomes more positive. This is known as the rising phase of the action potential. This influx of positive ions creates the electrical signal known as the action potential, which then travels down the neuron. Eventually, the action potential peaks at about +30 millivolts, Sodium channels begin to close, potassium channels open. Now, potassium channels are slow to open and slow to close. When an action potential happens and allows potassium to flow out of the cell. This loss of potassium, of positive potassium ions, promotes depolarization, which is known as the falling phase of the action potential. The neuron returns to resting membrane potential, but actually overshoots it, and the cell becomes hyperpolarized. During this phase, known as the refractory period, it is very difficult to cause the neuron to fire again. Eventually, the potassium channels close and the cell membrane or the membrane returns to resting membrane potential, ready to be activated again. The signal generated by the action potential travels down the neuron and can cause the release of neurotransmitters at the axon terminals to pass the signal onto the next neuron. And that is my video. I hope you've enjoyed it and you have a wonderful day.